Hello and welcome to the Culture Connection Speaker Series. I'm Michael Beckelheimer, coming to you today from Alexandria, Virginia, and I'm talking with Tim Rose, the founder of Alexandria History Tours, about how he followed his passion in life and started his own small business. This program is presented by the American Center of Moscow, which is supported by the American Embassy in Moscow. And if you're watching on the American Center's YouTube, VK, or Telegram channels, please post your comments and questions at any time. We'll keep track of the questions and ask them as they come in. So I met Tim when I moved to Alexandria about 3 years ago, and I wanted to learn the history of my new hometown. And I found Alexandria History Tours. And at that time, it was a one-man operation. It was Tim Rose on the streets of Alexandria with his notebook, explaining and teaching and really just giving a fantastic tour. And the company's grown, and now it's impossible to walk through Old Town Alexandria and not see Tim or one of his new guides out there with a group of tourists. So we want to talk to him today about how this idea for a business started and how he completely started something new and followed what he really loves. So Tim, welcome to our speaker series. It's great to see you.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Sure. I'm glad to see you. Let's start. I didn't give a big introduction here, but let's start with a bit about your history and where you studied, what you studied, your time in the military. Like, what was the history of Tim Rose before you got to Alexandria?
Great question. I'll kick it off with just talking a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Richmond, Virginia. So Richmond, for those of you who don't know, is the capital of Virginia. It's about 90 miles south of Alexandria. So that is where I grew up, went to high school, and then I attended college at Amherst College in Massachusetts. So went a couple hundred miles further north up into New England. A little bit colder weather up there, but it was a good experience. Specifically decided to study history, but actually with a dual degree in political science and religion. So the big part of political science, there was a lot of classes that I took on the American founding, on the history of founding fathers like George Washington, the Constitution, just really the basis for the American way of government, way of life, government. And then with religion, I complemented that with understanding all the early American religious traditions in the United States and where they came from. So obviously a lot of European history with that. And that is a big part of what feeds into what I do now in Alexandria. A lot of historic churches here, and so a lot of things that are here to explore. But then I did get into the military shortly after college. A big, profound moment for me, like a lot of young Americans when I grew up, was the events of 9/11. So September 11th, 2001. I was in high school at the time and watched, like a lot of people all over the world, what happened in New York City and at the Pentagon and the field of Pennsylvania, Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And that did influence me ultimately after completing my college, getting my degree, to decide to join the military. And I decided to go into the United States Marine Corps. Having a degree was a criteria for getting a commission, becoming a commissioned officer in the United States Marine Corps, which I achieved in March of 2011. I was commissioned in that date. If you ever come to the United States, there's a unique United States Marine Corps Museum, big, beautiful museum right off the interstate, about 30 miles or so south of Alexandria in DC. That is where I was commissioned in 2011. And I served 8 years active duty with 2 deployments overseas, and then did 2.5 years in the reserve. So 10.5 years time in service. Let me just pause there, Michael, see if that's given a good amount of background for you to get started.
Yeah, that's great. And I was going to ask you about your time in the military. You said that you enjoyed teaching history. And so I wanted to ask you, what was the occasion when you were in the military that you were teaching history to other soldiers? What were you teaching?
Okay, great question. So a lot of people do have this idea of Marines being just kind of really the stereotype knuckle dragging, go get them, hardcore charging folks. But Marines are a little bit more cerebral and intellectual than we probably get credit for. We do, especially general officers have often talked about having what's called a 5,000-year-old mind, which is the idea of you've got human history, you've got a lot of military history, and it's your job as a Marine officer to study that history, to learn that history, and to really read a lot, to absorb a lot of knowledge through reading, extensive reading. And then as an officer, you are really required to turn around and encourage your own Marines to read that material as well, and also be able to teach classes on military history, as well as anything that's pertinent to the military in our time now. So I had a lot of opportunities to teach. And on my first deployment, we were deployed on a U.S. Navy ship. And during that time, you have a lot of downtime when you're a Marine on a ship. You're actually looking for a lot to do. Now, the Navy's hard at work managing the ship. They're like our glorified taxi drivers, if you will. It's a little bit of a Marine Navy joke. But they are really doing a lot of the work, and Marines are really trying to stay fit on the ship. That's very hard. And then also trying to make sure they're still staying busy with classes, learning, things like that. So I had a lot of opportunities to teach, a lot of opportunities to teach military history and history very generally.
So after the military, you went to business school. So then what was this new epiphany that you should go from military and history and teaching and serving as a soldier, as an officer, to finance?
Okay, yeah. So the big thing with that is that my idea of being in the Marines was that I was going to do a 4-year period of time. A lot of people will choose to make it a career, 20 years or more. I really just wanted to make it 4 years, to do my service, do my duty to my country, and then move on. So I had always thought about what am I going to do next? And I did think about doing something financial related in terms of investment banking. My dad is an investment banker. He's been a municipal financial advisor for many years. And so I thought that would be something that I would pursue. Now, it ended up being I spent a little bit longer in the Marine Corps than I had anticipated, an additional 4 years, which was great. And I certainly appreciated that, enjoyed that. But ultimately, I decided I am going to make a transition into the civilian, the private sector, if you will. And the idea of finance was something that always intrigued me. There's a lot of history with the capital markets. There's a lot of history with finance that I find very interesting. So I've always been someone who studied the stock market, tried to do my own personal investing. So that's one of the reasons I was motivated to ultimately get into finance. And then business school, I actually attended business school while I was working at the investment bank. So I was doing school and I was working a lot. And ultimately, that's when I decided to make a clean break with the Marine Corps. I got out of the reserves at the time because I just found that it was a lot to balance all those commitments, but decided to focus 100% on what I was doing in the private sector.
Perfect segue. So we're going to go from that 100% in the private sector to a whole new experience. And what's interesting about your story, Tim, is this is the kind of American story that we all love. You know, you were a good student, you served your country in the military, you went into finance to make a good living, and then you realize what you really want to do with your life, and then you make that happen. So that's why we're talking today. The theme of this series is people who find their way towards their passion in life and make a living doing what they love to do. So let's jump then to your tour company in Alexandria. And Anton, if we can start the slides, that would be great. How did you get the idea to start a tour company? And how did you end up in Alexandria, Virginia?
Okay. Yeah, great. So let me get to the Alexandria part specifically. So in 2020, the global pandemic really threw what I was doing at the bank, a lot of what people were doing, obviously, into to a very uncertain position. I did start working remote at the time for the bank. and that gave me the ability to move back to my home state of Virginia. Now, my wife and I, we both met in New York City. I met her when I started working at the investment bank. And being both from Virginia, we both moved back to Virginia during the pandemic in 2020. Her job then took her to a DC based office, Washington, DC based office in 2021. And that is when we decided to make a future together. We decided to move to Alexandria together. And with that, the reason is that Alexandria is basically a bedroom community. It's very close to Washington, D.C. So we moved there. That's when I moved to Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria. And when I moved to Alexandria, I was blown away, was really impressed by just how much history was in that town. When you come to Alexandria, you feel like you are stepping back in time. The city is older than the United States. It's older than Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1749 officially. Many of the homes, the buildings that you see date back to the 1700s. It's a very well-preserved city, historically speaking. Now, for me, somebody who's interested in military history, government history, religious history, even banking history, Alexandria has all of those things in spades. You walk around and you will see buildings that were old banks. You walk around, you'll see places that have significance with every major war that was fought in the United States, going back to the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. You will also see multiple religious traditions, which then tapped into my interest in religious history. So Alexandria, for someone who's a big history buff, is like Disney World of history. I mean, it is really, really a remarkable, awesome place. Now, what I didn't notice was that there were not a lot of people that were actually teaching this history, that were doing tours of the history. If you go to a lot of cities in the United States, like Boston, Philadelphia, New York, you'll see tour companies everywhere. You'll see guided tours everywhere. Alexandria, I was shocked to see, did not have that. So that was the first seed that was planted in my head, that maybe there's something here that really speaks to my interests, and there could be an opportunity to do this as a profession. Do you want to talk about the other thing that sparked my interest? There, okay.
Yes, let's talk about Normandy.
Sure. So at the same time, I also took a trip to Normandy, France in 2022. So I moved to Alexandria with my wife in 2021. 1 year later, after seeing Alexandria, really getting into the city, we visit Normandy, France with my wife's family. This was an opportunity, something that I really believe every American should do, to go see the battlefields and see the beaches where American soldiers landed on June 6th of 1944, what we know as the D-Day landings. The Battle of Normandy did last for over a month after that. So there's multiple stories, many days of hard fighting. Many Americans lost their lives fighting on the beaches. Many of them came from Virginia as well. And what you'll see here with the picture on the right is the young tour guide that we had in Normandy, who had such a passion for the history there. And he himself was working for a bigger tour company in Normandy, France, but was starting to make plans and think about actually build his own company, which he has subsequently done. So that started to put another seed into my head to start my own company. I didn't make the decision right then and there. I was thinking about a lot of different things, but I would be lying if I didn't say that this really started to accelerate now my thoughts on doing something similar in Alexandria. And I still keep in touch with the guide that you see on the right, Yannick Sturck. He's a remarkable person and somebody who I'm proud to call my friend.
You know, I appreciate how you came to this revelation that you wanted to be a tour guide, and how you were looking for tours that were, you know, steeped in history, that really explain the history. And that's something I know that when I've spent time in Russia, and this is why I thought this would be a really great topic for our Russian audience, is so many great tour guides in Moscow, Petersburg, other places, and you really get into the history and the connections between literary figures, political figures, historical figures, and it's fascinating, and it's hard to find a good tour guide who can put all that together. I have a few. I'm going to click through some of the pictures here. I wanted to show this because so our audience will see that Alexandria is right across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And in this picture of yours, Tim, you can see the Capitol building, the dome of the Capitol building across the river.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it really is a part of the Washington, D.C. area. Talk to us about the kinds of visitors who come to you for tours.
Okay, great question. It really is such a wide variety. So when you think about, I went to business school. I had a background in finance. So you hear a lot about in business, who's your target market? Who are you actually going to be getting as your customers? And for me, my initial thought was I'm going to get a lot of kind of older guys that are history buffs that, really love and appreciate history. And then my mind has been blown by just how wide open the window is in terms of people that are coming with me on tours. Start with basic things, even from this week. I've had people on tours that are just visiting the area. They're retirees that are on vacation. I've had people on the tours that are in town for conferences. There's a lot of conferences, conventions that take place in and around the DC area. So people are looking for something to do. They come into town early before their conference, or they're a spouse and their spouse is at the conference and they themselves are looking for something to do. I've had student groups. I've had military groups. I've had associations, corporate groups that are in town for a corporate retreat. I've had political groups, legislative staff took a tour with me. And so I've had a wide variety. I've had friends that are doing friends reunions, friends trips. I've had alumni gatherings. I've had family reunions. So I think you're starting to get a sense of there's a lot of people that are just interested in doing this and doing tours. I think I mentioned the student groups. I've been shocked that I've had a lot more of these other professional groups and family groups. I'm hoping to get more student groups, but it hasn't been quite as many as I would thought, which in many ways is good. It tells me there's still a huge opportunity there. But right now, the majority of my groups haven't actually been those student groups yet.
And so where are we here? This is Captain's Row. Yep. Tell us a little bit about Old Town Alexandria and the history of the area and the architecture.
Sure. Yeah. So this is Captain's Row, and you might be able to see a little bit of the fact that it's one of our old cobblestone streets, which is very unique in the sense that there was actual stones. A lot of them were ballast stones, so they were stones that would have been in the hull of a ship to keep it balanced, and they were put into the road around 1793 to replace the muddy and the dirt roads that were there, and to actually have much more of a paved road, if you will. And so this is a very historic block because people see these homes, most of which do date back to the 19th century, so the early 1800s in particular. There's gas lights that are burning on the homes. There's carriage stones that are in front of the homes. There's a beautiful canopy of trees there, which makes it a very beautiful setting. And then when people are there, you're standing kind of up on an elevated slope. Alexandria was originally built right on the shores of the Potomac River, but it was elevated by about 30 feet. So it would have been a cliff above the river. So all of that is to say it makes a really beautiful, iconic background. It's one of the first places we either begin the tour there or we end the tour there as sort of a grand finale, because that's where people really just have this experience of we're stepping back in time and feel, just really, really immerse themselves in what is the beauty and the history of this place, Old Town Alexandria.
I will say, all right, so I'm sorry I bring everything back to Russia.
Sure.
But there are a few things you said, there are connections. One, June 6th, the anniversary of D-Day in Normandy, also Pushkin's birthday. In Moscow, all over Russia, when you go somewhere, there's always a connection with Pushkin. And I know we're going to talk about George Washington in a minute, but I just want to call that out. Alexandria is the same for George Washington. Everywhere you go, there's a George Washington connection. He lived there, he slept there, he visited there, he went to the bar there. And also, often in Russia, you will see new brides after a wedding go to specific points to have their pictures taken. And this street right here is one of those places in Alexandria that I live near here, and constantly there are new wedding parties on this street, people taking their pictures. So this is a very iconic street in town. Let me ask you about this house, the Carlisle House. Tell us a little bit about the Scottish roots of Alexandria and the how the town was founded.
Okay, yes. So the Scottish roots are extensive. The name Alexandria itself comes from the Alexander family, which is a family of Scottish descent that owned the original land that Alexandria was created out of in 1749. So that's where we get the name Alexandria from Alexander family. John Carlisle, where this big, beautiful stone mansion gets its name from, was another one of these Scotsmen. So he's one of our very prominent Scotsman who was a merchant in town. And so this actually gets into a little bit of my interest in terms of finance, early American commerce. He was involved in the tobacco trade. So like a lot of Virginia cities, if you do study Virginia history, so much of the original colony of Virginia going back to early 1600 was tied into the tobacco economy. Tobacco was what was known as a cash crop. So the original export from Alexandria was tobacco in 1749. There was some warehouses built on the shores of Alexandria in 1732 where tobacco was inspected. So it was an early form of colonial regulation of the quality of the product of tobacco being transported from the colony of Virginia. So that is really one of the first pieces of commercial infrastructure that Alexandria grew up around. Now, you mentioned the George Washington connection. Mount Vernon itself is only 8.5 miles from Alexandria. So George Washington at Mount Vernon did farm tobacco, and a lot of his tobacco was inspected and transported from Alexandria in the mid-1700s. Alexandria then switched to major exports like wheat, flour, and corn by the latter part of the 1700s. By the 1790s, it was one of the largest exporters of wheat in the country. The reason that that's important in terms of John Carlisle is that Carlisle himself transitioned from exporting a lot of tobacco to exporting a lot of wheat. And in the 1760s, he himself negotiated a 7-year contract with George Washington to export Washington's wheat from Mount Vernon through the port of Alexandria. So John Carlisle is one of the founding fathers of the town. You can see this big, beautiful stone mansion. He was very wealthy in his own right, but he also did marry into some wealth at the same time. One of the big names in Virginia, in Alexandria, is the name of Fairfax. Would you like me to get into that a little bit, Michael, or should I?
Tell us about Lord Fairfax.
Okay, so the Fairfaxes were also very prominent in the creation of Alexandria, again, going back to 1749. There was a gentleman named Lord Fairfax, the 6th Baron of Cameron. I know all those titles may not mean much, but as I describe him, he is basically like your, we'll call it your billionaire, your very wealthy Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg billionaire type of the colonial period. That's not because he had a website or a social media platform. He did have a lot of land. He had 5.2 million acres, which at the time was about 1/5 the size of Virginia. Now, the big irony with all of that, what's funny is that the actual acreage that he had was not the land that comprised Alexandria. Alexandria land was owned by that Alexander family. Nevertheless, the Fairfaxes themselves were involved in the creation of Alexandria in 1749. John Carlyle married a woman named Sarah Fairfax. So that marriage into the Fairfax family was very much, we'll call it like marrying up, if you will. So it's a good way to move ahead and move up in terms of society at that period of time. So there's a lot of people that are very closely connected with one another in Alexandria, the Carlyles, Fairfaxes, Washingtons, which makes it very fun to study and understand the history.
And one thing you do on your tour is you carry photos, old photos, and show the before and after, the then and now. This is City Hall, right?
Yes. Yes. So I don't know if this is just exclusively an American saying, but one of our sayings that I always live by is that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And to me, I could give somebody a whole presentation for hours, but when I show them a before and an after picture, or what I like to call a then and a now picture, I feel like it really, really resonates with people, how consistent the look and the feel of the town is. So City Hall was rebuilt in 1874. This photo here was taken sometime in the 1890s. That is actually when they started to string electric wire throughout the city, as you can see there. But they still had cobblestone streets, and they still had horse-drawn carriages, as you notice from the picture. But the look and feel of City Hall is still very similar to how it looks today. The architectural style is called Second Empire style architecture. And the architect was a gentleman of German descent named Adolf Klus. One of the things that's interesting, the name probably doesn't mean much, but he did design a lot of incredible buildings around the DC area. One of the notable ones that still exists to this day is the Smithsonian Castle, as well as Alexandria City Hall. So for that reason, people are visiting DC. They're going to see the Smithsonian buildings like the castle. And so it really resonates with them when you see this building and tell them that history.
And who are these people?
So we got the George Washington birthday parade that's taking place every year around George Washington's birthday, which we now celebrate on February 22nd. Fun fact, one thing that I always like to actually tell people is that George Washington himself celebrated the end of his birthday on February 11th. In fact, the last birthday of his life was in 1799, and he celebrated it on February 11th. The reason is that when he was born in 1732, the British were using the Julian or Old Style calendar. When he was 20 years old, they switched to the Gregorian calendar. That pushed the date to the 22nd, 11 days later, to February 22nd. That is what we still celebrate to this day. We have a holiday weekend around that time, President's Day weekend. So it's a 3-day weekend. Government offices are shut down. Most people don't work on that day. And so we do have this big parade that goes right through the heart of Old Town Alexandria. People are dressed up in colonial military attire. And so they'll even have the old muskets and cannons going through the heart of Old Town. So it's a special occasion.
And this, I believe, is a tour with some German students who are interested in the Civil War. You know, one of the things, if you could tell us about, is when you create your tours, you create them around certain events or themes. And I know you have a Revolutionary War tour, a Civil War tour, George Washington tour. Tell us a bit about the Civil War in Alexandria. And after this, I have some photos of Fort Ward. But tell us about these students from Germany. What were their questions about the Civil War? And how important was Alexandria during the Civil War?
Very important during the Civil War for many reasons. But let me just start with the German interest in this tour. The German students came, and they were interested in the Civil War tour, the Civil War history, yes. not so much the military history, so as much as the reasons that led up to the American Civil War, particularly a lot of the issues that had to do with slavery in the what we call the antebellum period, which is the pre-war period of the United States. So before the Civil War took place, which was between 1861 and 1865 in the United States. And they really wanted to know about that history in particular. So on the tour, we did talk to them about the history of Alexandria's connections to slavery. Alexandria, I mentioned the tobacco plantations, the tobacco farms. Many of those farms were actually had slaves or enslaved laborers that worked on them in the 1700s. And then in the 1800s, Alexandria did have a domestic slave trade that existed, and that's a big part of the city's history. It's not seen as one of the more prouder parts of the history by any means, but it's important to tell those stories, and those stories are important to talk about because it's all part of history. And so I did get into that with the German students on that tour in particular. But then one of the big things about Alexandria militarily during the Civil War, keep in mind the close proximity to Washington, D.C., the United States capital. That made Alexandria a very strategic location. And it was right after Virginia left the United States. So Virginia did join the government that broke away, the Confederate government. And right after it left, 13,000 federal troops, United States troops, came across the Potomac River and put the Virginia side of the Potomac, Arlington, Virginia, and Alexandria under Union or federal occupation, which it remained throughout the duration of America's Civil War. And it became a major center for medical care as well as logistics. Alexandria had 3 railroads that came in and out of the city during that time. And it also had access to the Potomac River, so a big waterway where a lot of supplies, a lot of troops were moved in and out of Alexandria to various parts around Virginia and throughout the United States. So that's a big component of Alexandria's Civil War history. That is really interesting and fascinating to get into on the tours. And the German students, which they were all high school students, they were on an exchange program. They really enjoyed and appreciated learning that history.
And here are some photos from Fort Ward in Alexandria.
Okay, so the big thing with this is that when those United States soldiers came into Alexandria, they actually then instituted a whole defensive perimeter to guard the United States Capitol. And so ultimately throughout the Civil War, there was about 68 forts that went around the U.S. Capitol. And many of those forts were in Alexandria. One of the forts that's been preserved to this day is Fort Ward. So it's actually been set up as a park, a museum. You can see there with the picture on the right, they brought in a lot of old military artifacts like this cannon, just to show how the defenses of D.C. would have looked and how it would have been constituted at that period of time. So that is a big part of Alexandria's history, being part of the defenses of Washington, D.C. during the American Civil War.
So in order to start your company, to do what you do so well, you need to know a lot of history. What was your preparation for this? Like, I know you studied history in college, and it's been a lifelong interest, but how did you become comfortable enough to stand in front of people, some of whom may know more than you, I would think, in your early attempts at guiding tours? That would be my fear. How did you get to the point where you became the expert?
Oh, great question. As you mentioned, Michael, I had a lot of prior history. I love history. I've studied it going back to when I was a kid. Obviously, being from Virginia, you learn a lot of George Washington history, a lot of Virginia history, and even if it is something you forget as you get older, you may not remember all the facts, the details. It's still in your head somewhere, and it's ready to. Once you dive back into it, you can start to make a lot of connections that you learned when you were growing up, and get familiar with it. So that really helped in terms of the learning curve itself. Military history as well. I mean, knowing a lot of the terminology, having been in the Marine Corps, just knowing what the different ranks are, that helps a lot. Knowing what the different terminology for defensive positions, for units, for logistics, that helps a lot as well. And then the George Washington history, I really just consume a lot of it. I read as many books as I can, even the obscure books that a lot of people find tough to read. I read a lot of his writings. You can find them online. A website called Founders Online. It's actually a National Archives-based website. 31,000 of George Washington's writings are digitized now, so you can read letters that he wrote throughout the entirety of his life. And if you just consume that as much as you can, I mean, there's so much to dive into, and I just spent hours a day really diving into that. And I still read and research. It never gets old. There's always something to learn. I mean, one house in Alexandria has just hours of incredible history. You're showing George Washington's townhouse in Alexandria here. This is one of those places where you start doing tours. I start talking to people about the basics of the history. Over time, I find even more things. So I have even more to talk to them about the house, why it was rebuilt, who rebuilt it, why it was torn down in the first place, the fact that it now looks exactly like George Washington's house. What was he doing with it? Why was he building it in the first place? So there's just a never-ending amount of interesting stories and facts to get into. And what I'll say is that once you start with a good baseline, once you have a good base and foundation of knowledge, everything really starts to build on itself, and you start to draw in a lot of different things. So you really make a lot of connections to different things, and it's almost like a kind of exponential learning curve at that point accelerates in terms of having this foundation. So I'll stop there because I'm hoping I answered a lot of your question there.
Yeah, well, yes, you did, and thank you. And I would expect that in Alexandria there are a lot of people who helped you, who sort of helped you along that process of learning all of the details of history. I mean, people here love Alexandria history, and that must have been really helpful to you.
Absolutely. The people that helped me the most were at the Alexandria Special Collections. We have a library in town. We have multiple libraries, but we have one on Queen Street that has a lot of the what's called the Special Collections Archive. So these are all the papers, documents, books that you can't even take out of the library. So you find a lot of original documents, a lot of original sources. And the staff there was incredible. They worked with me from the get-go. They knew what I was doing. They gave me a lot of books, a lot of resources. So I was able to do an incredible amount of research there, hours of research that I was able to do in 2022 and 2023 and even now. So even I'll be there even later today doing research. There's no end to what you can learn with all the history here.
That reminds. So most of these photos are from your Instagram account. These are photos you took while on your tours. And one thing I noticed over 3 years of Instagram is I don't think there's a single photo of the bottom part of King Street, which is the main shopping and partying area of Old Town, with the bars and the stores and the cafes and all of the tourists. I mean, it's a beautiful part of the town, and it's very historic. But do you find that do you not go to that area, or what is your relationship with that busy part of Old Town?
Well, I do now go to the area because one of the blocks that is right next to the visitor center is now actually blocked off for pedestrians. So I've actually started the tour on that block because it's a great street to walk on and to take people there. But then we do hit more of the side streets, and we do hit the streets that are off of King Street. A lot of people don't realize that Cameron Street, which is adjacent right next to King Street, used to be the main street through Alexandria. That's a little known fact, but that's where you'll actually find most of the historic taverns will be on Cameron
Right.
Street, because that was where in the 1700s and 1800s, really people would have been spending a lot of their time. And then there is a little bit of a modern history with King Street. About three primary blocks of it were actually rebuilt in the 1960s during a period of urban renewal, which basically means that, unfortunately, the city of Alexandria at that point in time, the downtown area in particular, was a little rough around the edges. It was not necessarily as nice as it is now. It still had the bones of a nice city, but it was a lot of people had in the era after World War II had actually moved out to the suburbs. A lot of the shopping was done in new malls, strip malls that were outside of town in the suburbs. And so the downtown actually started to lose some money, lose some funding. And so urban renewal was an attempt to actually inject some money, some capital into the city. And in doing so, they decided to actually rebuild and modernize about 3 blocks of King Street. It was very controversial at the time. They did tear down a number of historic structures. The good thing about that, the silver lining, is that it did actually give a lot of locals a sense of preserving the history. And so a lot of the historic preservation efforts accelerated in the 1960s and 1970s in conjunction with that urban renewal period. But that speaks to specifically, Michael, why we don't necessarily go up and down King Street as much as we do the other streets. And then, very practically, the other streets are a little bit quieter as well. They've got incredible history. So I like to try to bring my guests to places where they're not necessarily going to be bumping into traffic throughout the tour.
Sure, right. And you do go to the building at the bottom of King Street, the building I call George Washington Starbucks. It's the most beautiful Starbucks I've ever been in. It's this old. Tell me, that's an original building, right?
Yes, dating back to sometime around 1795. It was one of George Washington's aides de camp, which is a staff officer. It's an assistant to George Washington. People know the most famous aide de camp is a guy who has a musical named after him, Hamilton. For those of you that are familiar with that musical, Alexander Hamilton worked for Washington as an aide during the Revolutionary War. However, Washington had 32 total aides. 3 of them were from Alexandria. One of them was a man named John Fitzgerald, who was one of the very few Irish Catholics that lived in Alexandria, both before and after the Revolutionary War. And he was a very prominent merchant in the town of Alexandria. So he actually had a warehouse built at the foot of King Street, right near the Potomac River, around 1795. And that warehouse still exists to this day.
Beautiful old structure. George Washington was a Freemason. I wanted to ask you about this with your background in religion and thinking about many of the tourists who come to Washington and to Alexandria. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means today that George Washington was a Mason, and how do people relate to that now?
That's a great question. A lot of people that, if they're not Freemasons themselves, they want to know about Freemasonry. And most people think of conspiracy theories, they think of secret societies, and they think of things that basically maybe have a lot more intrigue to them, if you will. Although, if you notice this giant memorial, it's a 9-story George Washington Masonic National Memorial that's actually at the top of King Street in Alexandria. The local Alexandria Washington Freemason Lodge, the lodge that George Washington himself was a member of, had that big, beautiful structure built starting in 1922. They did have most of the exterior completed by 1932, which was the 200th birthday of George Washington. And for those people that think that Freemasonry is a secret society, I show them this big 9-story building and I say the secret is out. They're no longer trying to keep things a secret. They do still meet actually in this building. So they do still have active Freemason meetings. Now, Freemasonry itself has a couple of foundations. The best way to think about it, just in terms of what it actually is it's a civic society, fraternal organization. So it's actually it's like a club, if you will. It's a club that is very active in the community, very civic minded. The roots of it have three pillars. There is a root that is tied to Masonic, to the actual, Masonic guilds. So actually people who worked with their hands, worked with stone, and worked with brick. And then it has roots in the Enlightenment, so the Enlightenment period of the 1700s, and then in the Judeo-Christian faith. So those are the three elements that are really infused into Freemasonry itself. So you've got the religious element, the Enlightenment element, and then the actual trade school element, the trade element to it. I will say that it is somewhat controversial in terms of religious faiths now. For example, Catholicism and many denominations, Protestant denominations, don't actually allow their members to be Freemasons. The reason is because Freemasonry does have a lot of quasi-religious elements to it, which an organization like the Catholic Church would consider to be not appropriate for their congregants to partake in. So, but George Washington himself was a Freemason. Many American presidents have been Freemasons. I think one of the biggest reasons why Washington as a Freemason is important is Freemasons do encourage a virtuous way of life, encourage people to be good moral citizens. And that's something that George Washington cared about deeply. He was very much into what we might call self-improvement in today's language, but literally just trying to make himself a better citizen, a better man. Even for him, he was active in Christ Church Episcopal, which I think you'll show now. So he was active in the Alexandria Church, and so he himself would have wanted to be a better Christian as well.
I have a question here. What makes your tours of Alexandria different from other historical walking tours? And then we'll get back to this church.
Okay. I guess I would want just maybe to clarify with the question, is that other historical walking tours of Alexandria or others just
maybe in general? In
general. Okay. Well, really what would make Alexandria different, unique, is just the history that is in Alexandria itself. The fact that
what makes your tours different? I think that's the point. Yeah. How is yours different than other historical tours?
Okay. Yeah. No, I think with mine, I mean, for me, I really try to put an emphasis on a blend of both information, storytelling, so the entertainment aspect of it. So try to keep things fun, try to keep them entertaining, but also informative as well. And people really do want to learn. So I'm not a stand-up comedian. I'm not trying to be one, but I do like to interject a little bit of humor, information. And then I really have immersing myself in this, doing multiple tours a day. I really want to become a master of the craft of giving a good tour and actually taking people around the city and immersing them into this experience that they're going to remember for the rest of their lives. And I think I put a relentless focus on that. I really do. And every tour, I'm cognizant of the fact that this is could be someone's first time, not just in Alexandria, but first time in the United States, first time on the East Coast. I get a lot of people from the West Coast, and everything's new to them, everything they're seeing for the first time. And to the extent that I really try to drive home to people what's interesting, unique, fascinating about Alexandria's history and why you still see these things that you see, what they meant, what they represented. To me, I think that's what makes my tours different, or at least fun and special.
Are people more interested generally in the Civil War or the Revolutionary War?
Right now, Revolutionary War. I do think a lot of that has to do with the 250th birthday of the United States coming up. I also have the Revolutionary War tour that I have is set up as a public tour option at 1.5 hours, whereas my Civil War tour right now is a private tour for 2 hours. And I think when you do a private tour, one, it's a little bit more expensive to do that. I may try to get the Civil War tour into a public tour format. The only reason I haven't done that is because there's so much to cover with the Civil War history that I really want it to be at least 2 hours or more. So it's a little bit hard for me to say which in particular, other than the fact that the way I have things currently structured, the Revolutionary War history has been more popular.
Makes sense. So back to Christ Church, which we're seeing here. George Washington went to this church. Robert E. Lee later went to this church. You give tours actually of this church, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. That is. Oh, go ahead.
No, just tell us a little bit about it. We're getting close on time.
Sure.
And also the inside. I know that George Washington has a pew here. Tell us about the importance of this church.
This church is incredibly important. It is one of the early churches that was in Alexandria going back to 1773. It was attended, as you mentioned, Michael, by George Washington, who bought one of 10 pews in the church in 1773. The pews were actually purchased to raise money to finance the construction of the church.
So these pews are the rows of seats.
Yes.
We're looking at the pews now, right?
Yes. In particular, if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see that one pew that's got the open door. So there are doors on the pew. That is the one that George Washington himself purchased in 1773. And this is one of my, so just to answer a question coming in as I'm talking about this is one of my favorite spots to show people. It's probably the favorite spot. I just think any opportunity where you can actually sit in the same place that George Washington sat, and not just sitting for any reason. He is sitting there worshiping at the in the run-up to the American Revolution. So in 1773, 1774, and 75, as things are really starting to boil over in terms of the impending conflict between the American colonies and the British. And then Washington comes back and he attends services at the church in the 1780s. And then after his presidency, he comes back and he attends services at that church, including the last church service of his life that we know of was attended right there in that pew, November 17th of 1799, 1 month before he died. And you can actually sit in the pew, the same place that George Washington sat in. This is an incredible photo for me, because it is actually one of my professors from college who I mentioned. I have this background in political science. He is a political science professor who taught me a lot about the American founding, a lot of George Washington history. So for me to now bring my professor here to Washington's church, to his pew, and have him sit there was just a very, very special moment for me. And then I'll wrap up with this pew by also mentioning that 12 other presidents of the United States have gone to services at Christ Church and have sat in the George Washington box pew. And then very notable, if you've got the picture coming up as well, is that this is a location in which Prime Minister Winston Churchill attended a church service with President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on January 1st, 1942, a day that was only 3 weeks after the United States had been attacked at Pearl Harbor. That was December 7th, 1941. So 3 weeks later, they come to this church, to George Washington's church in Alexandria, sit in George Washington's box pew for a national day of prayer. And during the service, Winston Churchill heard a hymn called the Battle Hymn of the Republic that's very prominent, especially it was very prominent during America's Civil War. It was written by an abolitionist, and it was actually one of his favorite hymns, and he was moved emotionally by the playing of it, and he requested that this hymn be played at his own funeral, which it was in 1965.
Wow, that's beautiful. And you've been giving tours at this church as well, right?
Yes. I take people in there as often as I can. We try to go inside. We try to go in and see it and give people an opportunity to actually sit down and they can take a picture, as you saw, seated in Washington's box pew. A lot of people will get chills. They'll tell me they get themselves very moved by sitting in this church and sitting in Washington's box pew. And so that's very special. And I always appreciate when people just have the reverence for how amazing this history is, and the people that have been there, and the moments in time in which they've been there. I mean, this moment of January 1st, 1942. I mean, you can see the look in Churchill's eye at this point in time. I mean, London has been bombed. He has been going through just through absolute hell through the war, and at this point, he's now getting America to join the war and help the British. And so, I mean, for him to attend this service, you just have to imagine. Someone asked me what makes my tours different. I just want people to imagine, what was this leader thinking? What was George Washington thinking? What was President Roosevelt thinking? What was Churchill thinking? And just to kind of step back and just put yourself, that's how you immerse yourself in history, put yourself in their shoes. So I'm getting very excited talking about this, Michael. So thank you.
That's beautiful. And there's some more Washington history here. I remember when you told me this story on this corner of this old tavern where George Washington went before he went to New York to become president. That was another very moving story from history.
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. I find it incredible. To me, when I walked around, and before I started the company, I walked around and I saw a plaque, which you can sort of see it on the corner of that white 4-story brick building there. And the plaque said, "This is where George Washington was first greeted as President of the United States on April 16th, 1789, on his trip to New York City for his inauguration, which was 2 weeks later." And to me, I said, wait a minute, you're telling me right here at this location, this is where his friends, his neighbors, people that he knew, he did business with, he served with in the military, they gathered here and they celebrated their friend George Washington, and they toasted him for the first time as President of the United States. I mean, to me, it doesn't get any better than that. That to me gave me chills. It's just an amazing piece of history. And so that's one of the things that inspired me to start this company.
That's fascinating. And that's one of the cool things about Alexandria. And one of the surprises, I will say, I didn't realize how much George Washington played a role in Alexandria. Because I think of Washington across the river. I think of Mount Vernon, his home, several miles down the river. But so much of his life happened here. And that's what makes the history tour so interesting.
And if I could add one thing to that too, he did have an older brother, Lawrence Washington. And what's interesting is that if you read a lot of histories of Alexandria, Lawrence's role in the founding of Alexandria is not often discussed that extensively. But Lawrence Washington was petitioning the Virginia General Assembly in 1748 to start the town on the Potomac that is now Alexandria. So it was actually George Washington's brother, his older brother, that helped start Alexandria, which I think is actually something that over the last several months I've been doing more research on and starting to emphasize a lot more than when I initially started doing these tours.
And when George Washington laid out the plans for Washington, D.C., Alexandria was part of the city.
Exactly.
D.C.
100%. A specific letter that he wrote in which he wanted half a mile south of Alexandria's courthouse to actually be where the first survey stone, the first boundary stone that would anchor the city of Washington, D.C. to be laid and to be placed. So very much important for him that took place.
And why did Alexandria eventually leave the District of Columbia?
There's three issues. One of them does have to do with the slave trade that I had mentioned earlier. So some of the politics pre-Civil War that had to do with slavery, Alexandria having a business tied to the slave trade. There were some politics that you still see resonate today in D.C. The lack of representation that people have at the federal level, being Washington, D.C. being a federal district, so not actually a state. A lot of the people in Alexandria also felt that being under the thumb of the federal government was a hindrance to their own autonomy, their own development of their local economy, doing different infrastructure projects. So they did go back to Virginia in 1847, and that that objection that they had to being part of the federal district, I do think there was a lot of merit to that, at least in terms of the economic development, because in the 1850s, the town of Alexandria increased by a population increase of 44%. So there was significant economic growth once they were able to go back and rejoin Virginia. So those are a lot of the reasons why, in particular.
So what's next for you with your tours, with your career?
Absolutely. Yeah. So right now, I tell people I'm really just doubling down on what we're offering now. I do have plans to start a couple other differentiated tours on events like the War of 1812. I've tried some other kind of fun, unique tours tied to holidays. But really, I want to lean into the Revolutionary War history, especially with the 250th coming up next year. Even this weekend, for example, we're celebrating the Army's 250th birthday. There are going to be a lot of people that come to this area, to Washington, D.C. for that. I do have a lot of people that have booked in advance, so I don't know. I'll be curious if they're sort of coming to the area for that reason, or if it's just a busy weekend in particular. But I'm looking forward to leaning into all of the 250 celebrations over the course of the next year and even beyond. Keep in mind, the Revolutionary War in the United States officially starts in 1775, but the war doesn't end until 1783. So we have at least, and then we get our Constitution, U.S. Constitution, is much later than that. So we have tons of 250 milestones coming up that'll keep me busy for a long time.
So a long revolution is good for your business, right?
It's like they knew. No, I'm joking.
Well, Tim, we're at time. Thank you for joining us. This was really interesting. I hope someday everyone on this meeting will come to Alexandria and take one of your tours.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much. Michael, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. See you on the street soon.
Okay. See you soon. Bye-bye.